The hidden cost of immediate reaction. You think reacting is natural, but what you rarely notice is how quickly it places you under the control of something outside of you. A word is said, a tone is felt, a situation unfolds almost instantly. Something inside you shifts. The change feels justified, even necessary. It feels like you are responding to what is happening. But in reality, what you are responding to is not the situation itself, but the internal interpretation your mind has already constructed. This is where the hidden cost begins. Because the speed of your reaction removes your ability to examine what is actually happening. The moment you react instantly, you bypass awareness. There is no pause, no space to question, no moment to observe. The reaction becomes automatic, and in that automatic state, control is lost. Not in an obvious way, but in a subtle psychological shift where your internal state is now being dictated by something external. What most people never fully see is that reactions are rarely about the present moment. They are shaped by patterns, past experiences, expectations, insecurities, and assumptions. When something happens, the mind does not process it as neutral information. It filters it, assigns meaning to it, and then creates an emotional response based on that meaning. This entire process happens so quickly that it feels like one single moment. But it is not. It is layered, automatic, and largely unconscious. The tension lies in this gap between what is happening and what you believe is happening. In what you believe is happening, you feel triggered, but the trigger is not always the situation itself. It is the interpretation attached to it. And because this interpretation feels real, the reaction feels justified. This is why people defend their reactions so strongly. They are not just defending what they did, they are defending the meaning they have assigned to the situation. The deeper realization begins when you start to notice this process in real time, even slightly, even imperfectly. You begin to see that the reaction is not immediate, it is constructed. There is a moment, however brief, where awareness can exist. A moment where you can observe what is forming instead of becoming it, and in that moment, something changes. The intensity of the reaction weakens. Not because the situation has changed, but because you are no longer fully identified with the interpretation. This is where the shift begins. Not in suppressing reactions, not in forcing calmness, but in creating space. Space between what happens and what you do next. That space is subtle, but it holds control. Because once space exists, choice becomes possible. And once choice becomes possible, reaction is no longer automatic. Over time, this changes how you experience situations entirely. What once felt urgent begins to slow down. What once felt personal begins to feel distant. The need to react immediately begins to dissolve, replaced by a quiet awareness that allows you to observe before you engage. And in that observation, you start to see more clearly not just the situation, but your role within it, and from that clarity, a different pattern begins to form. One where your internal state is no longer shaped by the speed of external events, but by the steadiness of your own awareness. The silent rule of emotional power, the one who reacts less always holds the stronger position. But this truth is often misunderstood, because it does not look like power in the way people expect. It does not announce itself. It does not dominate conversations or impose itself on situations. It remains quiet, controlled, and often unnoticed at first glance. Yet beneath that stillness, there is a structural advantage that most people fail to recognize. What is rarely seen is the invisible exchange that happens during every interaction. People are constantly, often unconsciously, observing each other for signs of emotional movement. A slight shift in tone, a quick defensive response, a visible reaction. These become indicators. Not of strength, but of access. Because the moment someone sees what affects you, they understand where your emotional boundaries are weakest. And once that is understood, influence becomes easier. This is the unseen social pattern. It is not always intentional, not always manipulative, but it exists in almost every interaction. People test reactions without realizing it. They push slightly, observe the response, and adjust accordingly. If you react strongly, you reveal something. If you remain composed, you reveal nothing. And in that absence of reaction, a form of control begins to take shape, not over others, but over yourself, which is where real leverage originates. The mistake most people make is believing that expressing every reaction is a form of honesty or authenticity. But what they overlook is that uncontrolled expression exposes internal instability. It shows that your state can be influenced, shifted, and disrupted by external input. And once that pattern becomes visible, it becomes predictable. Others may not consciously think about it, but they will feel it, they will sense where you are reactive, and they will naturally move within that space. The psychological leverage point is subtle. It is not about suppressing emotion or becoming distant. It is about removing predictability. When your reactions are no longer immediate or obvious, the usual patterns of interaction begin to change. People cannot easily anticipate how you will respond, and in that uncertainty, their ability to influence you weakens. Not because you are resisting them, but because you are no longer participating in the same reactive exchange. This shift requires a different way of engaging with situations. Instead of responding to everything that presents itself, you begin to observe more than you express. You allow space between what you perceive and what you show. This creates a layer of separation. You are still aware, still present, but not immediately involved at an emotional level. That separation is what stabilizes your position. Over time, this changes how others experience you. There is a sense of steadiness, a lack of visible pressure points. Interactions become more balanced because there is no clear entry into your emotional state. You are not withdrawing, but you are no longer available to be easily moved. And in that controlled presence, something shifts. The dynamic is no longer based on reaction, but on awareness. And from that awareness, a different identity begins to take form. You are no longer someone who reveals everything through immediate response. You become someone who sees more than they show, who understands more than they express, and who maintains control not by force, but by quiet restraint. The internal battle before control. You don't react because you want to. You react because something inside you moves before you are even aware of it. It happens quickly, almost invisibly. A comment is made, a look is given, a situation shifts, and suddenly there is tension. Not outside, but inside. A subtle tightening, a rising impulse, a feeling that demands expression. And before you fully recognize it, the reaction is already forming. This is the part most people never truly examine. They believe the reaction is the event. But the real event happens internally, before anything is said or done. There is a moment where emotion rises, where interpretation forms, where meaning is attached. That moment determines everything that follows. Yet because it happens so fast, it feels automatic, almost unavoidable. The conflict begins here. You feel the impulse, but at the same time, there is a quiet awareness that reacting will not serve you. This creates friction. One part of you wants to release the tension through expression. The other part recognizes that doing so would only reinforce the pattern. This is not a visible struggle, but it is constant. It exists in small moments, repeated over time, shaping how you move through situations. What most people miss is that discipline is not about controlling the reaction after it appears. It is about noticing the moment before it takes over. That moment is subtle, but it is always there. A brief pause where awareness can enter. And when awareness enters, even slightly, the reaction loses some of its force. It no longer feels completely automatic. It becomes something you can observe instead of something you must act on. The principle is simple, but requires consistency. Not every internal impulse deserves to be expressed. Not every emotional movement needs to become external behavior. When you begin to see thoughts and emotions as temporary signals rather than commands, something shifts. The urgency fades. The need to act immediately weakens. You begin to separate yourself from what you feel. This is where mental boundaries start to form. Not boundaries that control the outside world, but boundaries that define your relationship with your internal state. You start to decide what you engage with, and what you allow to pass without action. This creates distancenote from reality, but from automatic identification with every internal movement. You feel, but you are not consumed by what you feel. Over time, this changes the entire structure of your responses. Situations that once triggered immediate reactions begin to slow down internally. The impulse still appears, but it no longer dominates. It becomes something you can sit with, observe, and let pass without expression. The reaction loses its authority, not because you suppress it, but because you no longer treat it as something that must be followed. And from this process, a transformation begins to take place. You are no longer someone who is driven by every internal shift. You become someone who can experience emotion without being directed by it. There is a calm discipline in this state, a controlled awareness that allows you to remain steady, even when impulses arise. The state where nothing moves you. Imagine a version of yourself that enters situations where others expect a reaction, and nothing happens internally. The same words are spoken, the same tones are used, the same attempts to provoke are made, but there is no shift beneath the surface. No tightening, no urgency, no impulse rising that needs to be expressed. What once felt personal now feels distant, almost neutral. Not because the world has changed, but because your relationship to it has. What most people never realize is what truly happens when reactions disappear. They assume that detachment creates distance from life, that it reduces engagement or dulls experience. But the opposite begins to unfold. When you are no longer pulled by every external input, your perception becomes clearer. You start to see situations without distortion, without the added layer of emotional interpretation that once shaped your responses. There is a quiet shift that happens when you stop being internally moved by everything around you. The mind becomes steady, not through force, but through absence of dependency. You are no longer tied to how things should go, how people should behave, or how situations should unfold. And without that attachment, there is nothing constantly pulling at your internal state. Stability becomes natural rather than something you have to maintain. The deeper principle here is that control is not found in managing others or shaping outcomes. It is found in stabilizing your own internal environment. Most people try to create peace by controlling what happens around them, but this creates constant tension because the external world is unpredictable. When you shift inward, when your focus becomes your own response rather than the situation itself, something changes. Peace is no longer dependent on conditions. Over time, this creates a form of consistency that is difficult to disrupt. You move through different environments, different conversations, different pressures, and yet your internal state remains the same, not rigid, not closed, but steady. You are present without being affected, aware without being entangled. This is not indifference. It is control without effort. Others begin to sense this without fully understanding it. Without visible reactions, without clear emotional entry points, the usual dynamics begin to dissolve. There is nothing to push against, nothing to provoke, nothing to destabilize. Not because you are resisting, but because there is nothing within you that needs to respond automatically. The interaction loses its usual structure. And from this, your identity becomes rooted in something deeper. You are no longer defined by what happens to you, or by how others behave around you. You are defined by your ability to remain unchanged within yourself. The need to react fades, the need to prove disappears, and the need to control loses its relevance. And in that quiet, controlled state, one realization settles without effort: one, nothing inside you moves without your permission, nothing outside you can truly disturb you.